right, well, once again, thank you all for joining us here tonight, and sorry for the slight delay. Tonight's presentation is Wine 101 with Gillian Katz, Discovering the Perfect Holiday Pairings. Joined certified, oh boy, here's me in my my sloppy mouth here. Sommelier Gillian Katz for her popular Wine 101 presentation. Learn about the basics of winemaking and wine tasting, and discover some perfect pairings for the holiday. There will also be a time to, quote, ask a somm. So bring your wine-related questions and feel free to sip on some wine during this fun and interactive workshop. And I want to thank, again, the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring tonight's event. And I want to thank the 30 plus here with us live on Zoom. I want to thank those watching along on Facebook and those that will be watching along after the fact on YouTube. So let's give Jillian a big virtual round of applause for joining us here tonight. And Jillian, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you again to the Friends of the Library for having me. I'm really excited to share more about wine with you all and hopefully answer a bunch of your wine related questions. So feel free to pop them in the chat as they come up, and there'll be time for questions at the end as well. So the more questions, the merrier. But as Robert said, my name is Gillian Katz. I am a certified sommelier. So you might ask, what is a sommelier? A sommelier is a wine expert certified by the Court of Master Sommeliers, which sounds really fancy and likes to think that it is. If you've ever been to a restaurant or to a wine store, chances are you've interacted with a sommelier. They might be wearing a pin that looks like that one. There are 4 different levels, and if you are interested in learning more about the process of becoming a sommelier, there's a really interesting documentary series that I would recommend called Salmon. And the first installment of the documentary is all about the process of becoming a master sommelier, which is the 4th and final level. So it's a very small percentage of people who become a master somm. I am by no means a master, but I do know a lot about wine. So I'm excited to share my knowledge with you all tonight. So tonight's agenda, first we'll be going through Wine 101, a little bit of winemaking, the processes that go into making wine and why wine is such a fascinating product. Then we'll go through sort of the basics of flavor profiles and tasting wines, some of the pairing rules that people like to go by when figuring out how to pair the right wine with the right food. And then a couple of recommendations around the holidays. And I know everyone's holidays are a little different this year, so some fun sort of ways to get excited about the upcoming events this month, and then plenty of time for questions and definitely questions along the way. And at the end, if you have any wines that you're drinking that you want a little more information on, feel free to pop those in the chat as well. And I can share a bit more information about the flavors that you might be tasting tonight. So first off, we'll kick off with Wine 101. And these are really the fundamentals of wine. There's so much to know, which is why people spend their lives learning all about it and reading every book in the wine library. But the basics really start with, you can grow wine pretty much anywhere. It's hard to find a country that actually doesn't produce some sort of grape-oriented drink, liquor, alcohol, juice. It grows in all kinds of climates, things like ice wine in the really cold, like upper Canada, all the way to, desert countries like the Middle East now produces wine. So they really are, grapes as a plant are pretty diverse in the places that they grow. And it's really the climate and the kind of grape, as well as the philosophy of the winemaker, that makes wine different depending on where it's grown. So things like the weather each year has a different profile just based on the different weather conditions of that year. The soil, things like, was it really rainy? Was the ground too cold? Was there a lot of fog? Different sort of factors that impact any agricultural product are prevalent in the winemaking process. So one of the big contributors would be as you can see in the image, the warm versus cool climate. So wine that grows in warmer climates generally has more exposure to sun and generally has higher alcohol content. and wine grown in cooler regions, the grapes are smaller, they're more compact, and they're lower alcohol wines. So it also depends on what grape varietals are grown in which places based on what's going to do the best where it's growing. But all these factors that contribute to wine and the taste of where it's from are called terroir, which is a fancy word to mean the taste of place. And I got really interested in wine through my study of anthropology in college. And it was really because of that sort of cultural, place-based factor in each winemaker utilizing what they have and the grapes of where they're grown and making sure that they taste like that vineyard versus any other vineyard in that region or any other Chardonnay from anywhere in the world. It should taste like that specific vineyard. So that's sort of how I got interested in wine. Next, we'll go through a little bit of the winemaking process. So if you've ever visited a vineyard, I know it feels like we traveled forever ago because we've been traveling virtually from Zoom, but this is what a vineyard looks like. Depending on where you are visiting, the vines might be more or less manicured. They might be irrigated, meaning that they can be watered and more regimented around, making sure they get the same amount of water, the same amount of sunlight every single day. But the process is much like, for the beginning, any fruit or vegetable that's grown. They're grapes, they're grown, they are picked and then sorted, and then they're pressed to extract the juice. Depending on whether they're producing white wine or red wine, the skins may or may not be removed right away. The skins are really what create color in wine. So if you cut into a green grape or a red grape, the inside is clear. And so it's just that contact with the skins through the press process, through the winemaking process, that gives red wine from red grapes the red color. So if it's white wine, they just remove the skins and the stems right away. The red wine might remain with the skins for a little bit longer. And then it goes into the process of fermentation. So that's when yeast is added to the grape juice, turning the natural sugar, like all juice would have a natural sugar, turns that natural sugar into alcohol. And then if it's a sparkling wine, it will actually undergo a secondary fermentation to give it that carbonated quality. And then in terms of production, the wine is filtered, laid to age in casks or barrels or tanks, depending on what kind of wine and what the winemaker, what the flavor profile they're trying to get out of the wine. It's then bottled, probably aged again, depending on the grape. And then it eventually, whether it's in a couple months or a couple of years, makes its way to your store where someone might buy it, continue to age it, or drink it young. So that's sort of the process from grape to bottle.
And Jillian, before you move on, Rachel wants to know, how do they remove the skins and stems? Do they use a machine?
Great question. So depending on the scale of the vineyard, generally I would say they do use a machine, almost like a giant sieve, because they'll press everything down. They extract all of the juice and they like smush it. And then all of the juice is let out of the tank and all of the skins and the stems remain. So they pump out the juice and then they continue to sort of sift or strain it to make sure that there's not any like big chunks of anything left. Sometimes you will get like really small pieces that sort of end up almost immersed in the liquid, and that's what ends up in the bottle at the end if you age it. That sediment is made up of tannins, which are actually like molecules of the grape skin that actually help the wine age over time. And so as it ages, the tannins come out of the liquid and they end up in the bottom of your bottle.
Great. Thanks, Jillian.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. All right, moving on. So I figured because it's the holiday spirit, people might be celebrating something or looking for an excuse to celebrate, as I feel like I am every day. But one fun sort of thing to bring into the conversation around the holidays is sparkling wine. So as I alluded to a moment ago, sparkling wine actually undergoes a secondary fermentation, generally in the bottle, which produces excess carbon dioxide. So much like when you add yeast to the initial just flat juice, it just, they let the yeast completely undergo the process, and then you don't have any residual carbonation. But if you do it in an enclosed environment in a very small scale way, you end up with that pressurized liquid. So that's why champagne and a lot of sparkling wine ends up with those sort of fancy corks that are like very, very much closed on so that it doesn't under pressure explode. But that's sort of what adds that carbonated piece. And there's 3 methods of making champagne or sparkling wine. Champagne itself actually has to originate from the Champagne region of France to be called rather a champagne. So there's the champagne or the traditional method. That's really the oldest of old school sparkling wine. It's actually rumored, or the myth is that it was discovered by monks, particularly Dom Perignon. So if you've heard of that brand of champagne, it's named after the monk who figured out how to, by accident, make sparkling wine. It's now a label owned by Moet and Chandon, but that's sort of how the legend became the discovery of sparkling wine. So there's the champagne or traditional method, which is all done in bottle. So that secondary fermentation happens only in the bottle. It's closed up, locked up under that crown, and it's opened once you drink the bottle of wine at the end of the winemaking process. The second is the Charmat or tank method, which is when they carbonate the liquid in a large tank and then bottle it. So it's bottled while it's already carbonated. And then the third is carbonation, which is almost like making sparkling water or cola when they put the liquid in a bottle and then they'll carbonate it using like a tube of carbon dioxide, and then they just cap it. So things like Andre and some of the lower end sparkling wines are generally made with that carbonation method. Oftentimes Prosecco and Cava are the Charmat and tank method. And then things like champagne are really sort of higher end, smaller production companies will use that champagne traditional method. And as I said, champagne, to be called champagne, technically has to be produced in the Champagne region of France. Prosecco, which is an Italian variety of sparkling wine, has to be produced in Veneto, Italy. They usually use the Charmat method. Cava is from Spain. So every country has sort of adapted its own sparkling wine and created its own sort of marketing method around their country's sort of name and ethos. But they all sort of also undergo their own method of making it in the first place. So it should taste a little bit different, maybe have a different carbonated quality. But the cool thing about the champagne method is that if you leave, and generally the Charmat as well, if you leave a glass of champagne in your glass, just poured for like a day, it will continue to bubble. It's that sort of carbonated and yeasted that it's still very much living, and it will continue to bubble for days. You can sort of tell if something was made in that carbonation method if it eventually goes flat, because like any sort of soda, if you leave it out long enough, you'll end up with just, non-fizzy Coke. So no one likes that. But the good thing is that you end up with just flat wine, which tastes pretty good too. And then there are a couple of different things you might see on a champagne label, mostly attributing to the level of dryness or the amount of sugar that is still in the liquid. So something sweet, they range from sweet to dry. Something brut is sweet. Something extra brut is between sweet and dry. And something called dry would be dry. It means there's no residual sugar. It's just going to have that sort of tart, citrus forward flavor of a sparkling wine. Something sweeter might have a little bit more of a honey flavor, and it might you'll sort of taste more of like a dessert flavor rather than that really crisp aperitif. So continuing along with the flavor profiles, in white wine, there's in all wine, I would say, actually, there's sort of a divide between sweet and savory flavors with any food, dessert, drinks. Those are sort of the big buckets of flavor profile, and wine is no different there. So with white wine, you would get a fruit forward flavor. So that's a mouthful. Generally something citrus or floral. So you end up with honeysuckle, with lime, lemon. You might get sort of a peach or a kiwi. People say that Sauvignon Blanc tastes like passion fruit. There's a lot of different flavors you can use to describe wine. You'll get a kick out of hearing them in the Somm documentary. They actually liken some wine to a can of tennis balls. People get very specific when it comes to the flavor profile of wine. But for the sake of this Wine 101, we'll keep it a little bit more basic. So the fruit forward will be that citrus and the floral. Something off dry, which would be a little bit sweeter, would be more aligned with a honey, an apple, a pear, something a little bit more viscous almost, rather than so clear and crisp. And then the savory profiles would be an earthy or an oaky sensation, so something more herbaceous. You could get like a mossy smell, a little nuttier, something like a hazelnut or an almond. And then with Chardonnay, specifically from California, you end up with something called malolactic fermentation, which results in that buttery flavor. If you've ever had wine and thought like, this tastes just like popcorn at the movie theater, chances are it's undergone something called malolactic fermentation, which is a process mostly just to get a desired flavor out of the wine. And Chardonnay from California is often the only wine to undergo that second sort of kind of fermentation. And then some common varietals, which I'm sure most of you have heard of: Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling, and Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio. Pinot Grigio being the Italian variety, and Pinot Gris being from anywhere else. So there are some common white wines to look out for and some common flavors you might experience. And then likewise with red wine, same thing, sweet and savory. Sweet red wines are often fruit forward, so they have a more black or red fruit, red berries, stone fruit, things like cherries, nectarines, plums, blackberry, raspberry, blueberry. And then the savory side again is a drier, more tannic, especially the mouthfeel. Tannins you really feel on your tongue, whereas acid, which can be in red or white wine, is more felt like under your jaw. You'll feel sort of your salivary glands sort of perk up when you have something that's super acidic. The savory wines will also have more of an earthy and oaky flavor, something like, dirt or damp earth. Meat, leather are often used to describe some kinds of red wine varietals. And then you might get something more vegetal, so like a bell pepper smell or flavor. Cabernet Franc is sort of known as having that really specific bell pepper smell, which is kind of a cool, if you smell it, some of them at least, it really just smells like you're smelling a bell pepper. And again, some of the common varietals there are Pinot Noir, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Malbec. You might have heard of Merlot. There are a bunch of different red wine varietals, and they often blend them to get the desired flavor. And then the other thing I'll say about the flavor profiles before we move on is that sweet wines or fruit forward wines are often from the New World, so anywhere other than continental Europe. And then savory wines, that really earth forward flavor, are more well known as being from continental Europe, so France, Spain, Italy, any of those sort of really old vine growing vineyards. Those will have that more earth forward flavor, where the first thing you smell or taste will be those more earthy, that more vegetal, leather, dirt, whereas a lot of New World wines will have that initial smell of red fruit, cherries, apple, all those good things. That's a good way to, if you're doing a tasting, to figure out which one you're trying to get at, is the old versus New World trick.
Jillian, we do have a question. Does one flavor for the wine age better than the other?
That's a good question. I would say not necessarily. It really depends on the grape more than the flavor. There are often some wines that people age more so than others, or for longer amounts of time. And that really has to do with the grape makeup rather than the flavor that they produce. So grapes with thicker skins, like a Cabernet Sauvignon, has that really tannic, drying feel if it's really young. And as you age them, those tannins begin to break down, the flavors start to become more well-rounded. You get more of that fruit flavor that comes out after those tannins really diminish. And that's why they age wine. And then that's what you'll see at the bottom of a bottle, will be that sort of sediment or the breakdown of those tannins. So I would say it really depends on the grape more than the flavor. But the grapes certainly have different flavors. So that's sort of where that comes in.
Another question, is oak used as often as it has been used in the past?
That's a good question. I think winemakers are starting to get a little more creative around what they use, especially because oak is not very environmentally friendly. They can only use the barrels depending on the flavor that they want to get out of them. For 1, 2, 3, maybe if they're lucky, up to 10 vintages. But the wine might age in the barrel for 3, 5 years before they even bottle it. At which case, then it doesn't have that new oak flavor if that's what they're trying to get across in the wine. So I think they're starting to use more like, clay tanks. They're using more metal. They're using different devices to try to get different flavors out of the wine. But that being said, the oak is really pivotal to some of the wine's sort of desired flavors. And so winemakers who are trying to aim for that really classic Cab or that classic Pinot Noir, that classic Chardonnay, it's going to be pretty tough for them to find an alternative to oak. But that being said, there are also winemakers who are using used barrels from other products like bourbon, like whiskey. They're trying to sort of get smarter about repurposing different mechanisms so that they can save the environment a little bit more.
Great. One more question. Well, so first off, that last question was from Vin. Next question from Stephanie. Does storing the wine on its side help with aging?
It does. So most wines are aged on their side. There's some argument over whether that's productive or not. But the main reason for it is that it allows the liquid to constantly be in contact with the cork. So in wines that are not used with a traditional cork closure, like a screw top, or some of them now have like a metal cap, there's no reason for them to be stored on their side. Cork is also from a tree, so again, not super environmentally friendly, but it is a living organism. And so air can pass pretty easily between the liquid and the cork. So by laying it on its side, you're maximizing the surface area between the liquid and the cork, which is helpful for just keeping it aerated and alive while it's in the bottle for an extended amount of time. The most important thing I would say with aging is temperature. You don't want to keep the wine anywhere too warm or too cold. Ideally, it's just a steady, even in the winter, like a 50 degree, anywhere between 40 and 50 degrees, and it shouldn't change temperature all that much. So like places above your fridge or near an oven and for long-term aging are not ideal.
Great. Mike, I see your comment. So I'm going to, we'll save comments to the end, but I will relay that. Shelley does have a question. Can you age a wine for too long?
Yes, that's a great question, Shelley. So you definitely can ruin a wine by overaging, which is like such a sad thing to me. Wine definitely has a shelf life. It's really tough to figure out what that is. I would say if someone could come up with like an app for like, should I drink this today? I would buy it because it's the most imperative piece. And what's tough is you might be one of the people who's been aging your wine the longest. No one else will know what that wine will be like. The silver lining as someone who's interested in just flavor profiles of wine is that regardless of what it tastes like, it's an interesting taste to taste. And so you're learning something about the wine after so much time. But there are especially old world vineyards in France and in Germany, even in Austria, who've aged wines for like 100 years. And the color completely changes, the flavor profile completely changes. Sparkling wines generally lose that carbonation. Red wines lose color. So if it was a really deep burgundy, it's going to be a much lighter red. And white wines actually gain color. So I would say trying to keep an eye on the color is a good instinct to try to figure out about the timing. And then there are some forums on like Vivino and on a couple of other wine websites that can try to help figure out if the wine is ready to drink. And you can also always contact the vineyard. There's often an email address on their website that will say, if you need advice with any of our library wines, they're really the ones who are the most in touch. They know, exactly what happened that year, how much rain it got, and all of the factors that go into it. But yes, it's definitely possible to overage and you just lose a lot of the flavor that wine was really holding on to.
One more question. Not sure if there's a one-size-fits-all answer here, but Mike wants to know, what is the shelf life after opening the bottle?
That's a great question. So white wines tend to last longer after opening, mainly because people refrigerate them. And that is not something that's unique to only white wines being able to refrigerate. I would say any open bottle should have a home in your refrigerator. It's sort of counterintuitive, but if you leave the wine out for about 30 minutes, it should come to room temperature and sort of open up. The cold really keeps the wine closed, and so you won't get as much flavor from a really cold wine, but it will definitely help preserve the wine for longer. I would say white wines can last, 5 to 7 days, and red wines maybe closer to 3 to 5. But if you refrigerate them, you might get that closer to 7 benchmark.
Great. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you. All right, so moving right along, these are great questions. Keep them coming. Some pairing rules. So as we approach the holidays, it's helpful to know, you can't really ruin, in my opinion, a pairing, but you won't get the amount of flavor out of the wine if it's paired with something that's totally overpowering it. And so you want to let the wine really shine. And sometimes wine actually tastes really differently with specific foods like cheese or crackers. You'll get a lot more out of the wine and the flavor profile if it's paired with something else. And likewise, you won't get anything out of it if it's paired with the wrong thing. So in order to maximize that flavor, there are a couple of rules that people like to follow, and they're very flexible. And, what I love about wine is that it's all about, your personal level of taste. So, who am I to say that the wine I love, you should like? It's really up to you and how you experience flavor, much like anything that you eat or drink. It's totally subjective. So these are just some guidelines, but again, totally up to you. So the first one is like with like, so salty foods with a high salinity wine. So something like an oyster with a Chablis from France. It's a really high sort of saline flavor, high acid, and it just complements the salty flavor of a seafood really well. The second is opposites. So completely against the like with like, you can do something completely contradictory. So something really spicy like a Thai curry or an Indian dish with something sort of on the sweet side. So like a off-dry Riesling or a Gewürztraminer, something that has a little bit of a fruit-forward flavor can actually really help balance out something that's really spicy. And same with something sweet with something salty. That's sort of where, a dessert wine, a sauterne might pair really nicely with a blue cheese. You sort of end up with that really sort of almost like M&Ms and popcorn. They just sort of work together. Chocolate covered pretzels. It's that sort of counterintuitive, but they just do a good thing together. So those can sort of work with wine as well. The third is the things that grow together go together. And so if you're eating Italian food, you can drink Italian wine, and it's pretty on par that it'll be a good pairing. It makes sense when you think about the food coming and being developed from the land that produces that wine. The flavors are just all coming from the same sort of harvest basket. And so they just sort of bring out the best in each other as they would had you been eating Italian food at a beautiful restaurant in Tuscany and drinking a super Tuscan wine. You can sort of travel to wherever where you wish you were going. You could take out a fun travel book from the library, open a bottle of wine and make an Italian dish and pretend like you're on vacation. And then the fourth strategy is just balance. So heavy foods need heavy wines, light foods need light wines. And if you think about it as a scale, if you have a really heavy food and a light wine, it's totally going to tip the scale towards the food. Same with a really light food and a heavy wine. You're not going to taste anything in the dish that you spent a long time cooking. So it's really all a balance and making sure that the food and the wine complement each other. And like I said, you really can't go wrong. You might not get the maximum flavor profile from the food or the wine, but that being said, like you'll still get the wine and the food And that to me is a good night. So, and then we can apply it specifically to the holidays. So I know this year the holidays are a little non-traditional, but I figured I would do a couple of highlights that, outside of a traditional sort of Christmas dinner, which I'm happy to talk about as well. These are sort of a few fun ideas. So latkes for the Hanukkah celebrators or the non-celebrators. I can tell you the ones from Trader Joe's are like just as good as the homemade ones. Champagne actually pairs perfectly with latkes. That sort of like French fry, like oily potato is perfectly cut with a sparkling wine and a really high acid citrus sort of tart crisp flavor. They, again, sort of that heavy food is actually balanced out with that really crisp acidic wine. So that's sort of a fun pairing to celebrate Hanukkah. Before Christmas, I think it starts next week. So if you're looking for something to celebrate next week, that's ready for you. For Christmas, if you're doing takeout, I know we've all been cooking a lot more than we might have been, and it's looking like we're going to keep cooking at home. If you want to do something fun takeout for Christmas or for one of these fun holiday nights, and you're thinking something, a little outside of your comfort zone in the kitchen, something maybe like a Thai food, or an Indian dish, something spicier. Again, that pairing of something a little bit off dry, a little sweeter, like an off dry Riesling, a Gewürztraminer, or even a Sancerre, which is a drier wine, but more fruit forward, should really help balance out those spicy flavors and give you, you might need more water than wine in terms of, cooling off your tongue, but you should at least be able to taste the wine paired with the spicy food. For New Year's Eve, one of my favorite sort of takes on a sparkling wine and something more celebratory around the winter months is actually a sparkling red wine. They're not that hard to find, and they're actually not very expensive, which is sort of a fun, sort of cheap way to celebrate. I think because they haven't really made it to the mainstream, people don't know to ask about them. So Lambrusco is a great option, which is Italian. And it's a little bit fruitier, but not super sweet. The carbonation really cuts that sort of fruit forward flavor. And that's from a specific region in Italy, a sparkling red. And then a sparkling Shiraz is actually, Shiraz and Syrah are the same grape. Shiraz is the Australian word for Syrah, and they make a really great, it's definitely deeper in color, a little bit heavier in flavor profile, but again, really delightful with those bubbles. So that's a really fun treat, even if you're just looking to celebrate a Saturday night. That's sort of a fun, low-cost way to do it. Just ask at your local store for a recommendation for a sparkling red, and I bet they have one in stock. And then finally, when pairing with dessert, I know we've all been trying to get creative with cooking, and you guys have that amazing cooking class coming up with the library next week. If there's a dessert component, I would recommend pairing port with pie. Dessert wine is sometimes underrated. People are ready to sort of finish off the meal, but it's a great sort of nightcap and a fun way to sort of pair a new flavor profile with, your home cooked dessert options. So port really pairs nicely with, apple pie with a fruit offering. And then Sauterne pairs really nicely with chocolate, especially dark chocolate. It's really sweet, almost jammy, and it really cuts that sort of dark chocolate flavor really nicely. And if anyone has specific menu items that they're struggling with in terms of pairing, feel free to write them in the chat. I can provide some sort of off-the-cuff recommendations.
Well, that'll be fun. So Stephanie, Jillian, we do have a question from Stephanie.
Yeah.
Sort of a general question about pairing. When pairing wine with food, should you try the wine and then the food, or the food and then the wine? What comes first?
Great question, Stephanie. So I would actually say try them both on their own. So try the wine, maybe then try the food, like give it a minute, have a sip of water. So you can give the wine a chance to see what it tastes like on its own. Try the food, see what you're expecting. Chances are you know what that tastes like more than you might the wine. And then try them together, because actually the wine and the food could create a whole new flavor opportunity, especially when you're drinking. Like a few weeks ago, I had a Cabernet, and I was like, it's good, but you can't really get it had been aged. You couldn't really get the full flavor of the wine. you try it with a piece of cheese and it's a completely different wine. It just has a different profile in its entirety. And so I recommend, know what the cheese tastes like, know what the wine tastes like, and then give them the chance to do their thing together. Because you might get a mouthful and think like, this is not a good combination. Like, I'm never doing that again. Or you might be like, whoa, this is a really cool, totally new flavor.
Let's see here. Shelly wants to know, what should she pair with Cava?
Yeah. So Cava is very much similar in flavor to like any sparkling, like a champagne, a Prosecco. I would say it's less dry compared to a champagne or a Prosecco. It's a little bit sweeter and a little bit less effervescent for whatever reason. They just have a different mechanism. It's not flat by any means. It's just like the bubbles feel smaller. I don't know, they have different pipes over there in Spain or what. But I would say it pairs well. Sparkling wines are really high acid. And so they pair well with something a little fattier, which is why, they feel so lavish because, back in the day, they were eating them with like, foie gras and caviar and these really heavy flavors, really fatty foods. But they do the same thing with French fries as they do with foie gras. So like, fry something up, fried chicken even, they would make like a great pairing.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think this is pretty much the end of my presentation. So now's the time to ask.
Oh, wonderful, great. So if folks have additional questions for Jillian, start getting them into the chat. I wanted to jump backwards, Jillian. A few folks had made some comments.
Yeah.
Elaine says, when in Italy on a bike tour, and by the way, Elaine, I see Elaine everywhere on her bike. She's driving by the library on her bike multiple times a day, it seems.
Love it.
When in Italy on a bike tour, we noticed rose bushes at the end of the rows and was told that was how the vineyard would know if there was a beginning of a bug infestation, as the bugs would attack the rose bushes first. Have you heard that? I
have. That's a great point. Oftentimes people think if you plant rose bushes near the wine will taste like roses. And it's, that's a myth. You might get some sort of sensation of that just from, that terroir. But it's mostly, yeah, exactly that, to prevent bugs from getting at the grapes. The grapes are far more valuable than the roses to the vineyards. And so they want to make sure that they prevent any sort of issue when it comes to ruining, every single grape on the vine. Mike says that he's a fan of bourbon that's aged in bourbon barrels. Taste is very nice. Yeah, it sort of gives it a caramel flavor. Yeah. Let me see here. Stephanie would like to know, where are you from? And a few typos there, but where are you from in Massachusetts? I think that's what she's saying. And can I purchase a good variety of South African wine? Where can I purchase a good variety of South African wine? Yeah, that's a good question. So I grew up in Marblehead, Mass on the North Shore, which is where I have been spending most of my time in quarantine, but sort of between the Boston and Marblehead. And I would say, I don't know, how far is Tewksbury from Salem? Yeah, I'm really bad at that. I would say 30 to 40 minutes, perhaps. Okay. So not super close, but there's a great wine store in Salem, the Salem Cheese Shop. And one of my favorite, it's just like, to me, it's like going into, I don't know, a department store. They have like the most beautiful arrays of wines and cheeses, sort of makes, and they'll help you pair the wine with the cheese so that you sort of optimize the flavor profiles of both. I would say they have a good variety from everywhere. If you're specifically looking for South African, I would try some of the online stores. I know we're all ordering everything online. There's one that I love in New York called Bottle Rocket, and they have a great South African selection. But chances are your local shop will have a couple if you ask, and then go to another local shop and they'll have a different selection. But South African wines are great. They are a little hard to come by. Jill would like to know, what would you pair with a Bordeaux? Yeah, so Bordeaux blends are great. They're very typical of an old world wine, super earth forward, really dry. So I would pair them. I would give them something meaty to hold on to because I think they can be overwhelming if the food is too light. So they would do really well with like a really great roast chicken, with a duck, even with like a skirt steak, something that has enough sort of fat to give it something to hold on to, but not the wine, nothing too heavy that it's going to overpower the wine. I would say like anything too saucy might get tricky with a Bordeaux.
Let's see. Rachel would like to know, I would like to get a wine for the year my child was born and age it till she's 21. Do you have any recommendations on good wines, or how to go about doing that?
Yeah, that's it. I love that idea. I would say definitely like a Bordeaux will age really well. A California Cabernet would age pretty well. So you want something that you're buying young. Often wines at the store are not actually from this year. So depending on when your daughter was born, you might have to wait a couple years to actually get the bottle unless you're buying it directly from the vineyard. And that would be amazing as well, especially if it's a place you visited. You can always buy directly from the vineyards online. Most of them, especially now, are shipping direct to your home. But I would say, yeah, anything that's a thicker grape varietal, so a cab or anything with a pretty solid cab, like enough cab in it to age long enough. 21 years is a good amount of time. So I would say that, or I would say a champagne would probably stand up to age for that long as well.
Mike wants to know, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. So Mike wants to know, what are your favorite local vineyards?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually don't think I've been to any local vineyards. I'm totally open to suggestions if there are some. Such a fun activity. I've been to like local breweries more and like orchards that do cider, but never to, I don't think ever to a local vineyard. So it's on my list.
All right. Shelley would like to know, oh, and by the way, so Mike mentions that he recommends the Tewksbury Oakdale Wine Store, located in the Oakdale Plaza, where the market where one of the market baskets are, near the country club. They have a large selection, and they supported the library, which is true. We've had our Friends of the Library organizations had several fundraisers there. Shelley would like to know, what wine would you pair with salmon? And this could be salmon that is simply grilled with a rub that's savory, or that is grilled with honey and tastes sweet.
Salmon's tricky because it is a really powerful flavor. The first thing that I would like, my first inkling is something like an old world white that's like probably can stand up a little bit more to the salmon flavor and isn't quite as overpowering as a new world. The tricky part with pairing like a really oaky Chardonnay or like a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is that they're super overwhelming in that they have a very distinct flavor profile that like just kind of doesn't work with food in my mind. They're great wines. They pair really well with cheese. But aside from that, it can be sort of tricky. So for salmon, I would say either preparation could sort of hold up to a Chablis or a Sancerre, or any sort of old world white. I think like a Muscadet could be nice, something really sort of dry, especially with that sweeter preparation. And then the other sort of, I don't know about, this is me thinking out loud. I don't really know flavor profile wise, but a rosé would be great, I think, with a salmon, especially a dry rosé with that sort of like dry rub grill style. Sounds to me like a bite of summer, which I can't believe it's December. We have a long way to go until summer again. But that sounds divine to me.
So Jillian, Vin wants to know, what is the French new wine? Not sure what he means, but what is the French new wine?
Well, I don't know what's new. Well, I don't know. France is pretty old school when it comes to wine. They have a lot of rules that they really like to follow, especially when it comes to naming and regulations. There's very little interference when it comes to old world, specifically French wines. No irrigation, no, watering I've been to vineyards that actually play music for their grapes as a method of trying to, juice them up a little bit. But they're trying to get experimental. I give wineries credit. I think it's an industry that hasn't really innovated much. Between packaging and different sort of grape varietals, people are starting to get a little bit more excited about experimentation. And the new big trend, I would say, both in France and really globally, is natural wine. And you'll start to see orange wines, really sort of really light, chillable red wines are great. And you can make them with a lot of different grape varietals, and vineyards are trying to figure out, you might have a crop of grapes that aren't peak, and you don't feel comfortable putting them in your really high end small production, but you want to use them because we want to use everything that we make. And so they start to get a little experimental around what they make with them. So orange wine is becoming really popular, as is rosé, especially in France.
Never heard of an orange wine. You have me intrigued here.
Yeah.
Couple of recommendations for vineyards. Mike recommends Westport Winery, and let's see. And then Jill recommends Flag Hill and Zorvino, which is in New Hampshire. And then for Italian wines, Felicio Winery, also in New Hampshire. I'm probably mispronouncing these things, but people can read them in the chat. Amanda wants to know, what is your favorite organic wine? And I'd like to know, in case I missed it, what is your favorite wine overall?
Okay. Well, I don't love to say my favorites because, as I said, everyone should have a different favorite. But in terms of organic wine producers, there's one that I love in the Napa area called Mathiasen. Steve Mathiasen is really like an agricultural innovator when it comes to wine. He's really like a mainstay in the Napa community. And he does a lot of the sort of vine preparing and grooming for tons of vineyards in addition to his own label. And they farm grapes that most other people in Napa don't. But he does a great job, and they tend to be a little bit lower alcohol and a little bit funkier in profile, a little mustier than your traditional, Cali Cab or Bordeaux blend. And then my favorite wine in general, I've been drinking more Zinfandel now. And this is, my favorite changes every day. But I've been drinking more Zinfandel. I think it's a nice alternative to a Cabernet. Cabs really need a lot of age to develop. And Zins are much more drinkable when they're young, so you don't have to have the patience to drink them. But they're also a little bit spicier, just a different flavor to try if you're into like a full-bodied red wine.
All right, so as we begin to wrap up here, Shelley has another question. Who's drinking wine? Do millennials drink wine, or is it for baby boomers? Who's doing the majority of the wine drinking?
I think everyone's drinking wine. If you ask me, I'm a proud millennial, and me and all my friends drink wine. That could just be because I'm into it. But like, I think there are some trends in terms of wine that millennials are far more attuned to or excited about than than previous generations. Like rosé has completely exploded among the millennial population. Whispering Angel, Miraval, like Summer Water, Hampton's Water. There's so many brands that actually were pretty exclusively created in France for the American market because they know that we are sometimes suckers for fun marketing fodder. But that being said, rosé has now become eponymous with summer. So I would say that's a millennial impact right there. But in terms of like older generations, I would say the older you are, the older your wine might be, and you might be more patient with aging. You might have started your collection already, and so you have some wines that are cellared and really ready to drink. Whereas a younger generation, millennials, as the stereotype says, love experiences. We spend our money on travel. We move around a lot. That's not super conducive to collecting a ton of wine. I know the joke is that millennials will never own homes, but you need to have a home to have a cellar. So So hopefully millennials are getting adjusted to the idea that we're settled down now, and it's time to start aging things for later.
There you go. Last question, unless someone gets one in under the wire, goes to Mike. Mike would like to know, box wines, good or not?
Good question, Mike. So I would say the legend is that they are not good. And I would say that the ones that have existed for a long time are probably still not, they're not my thing. They might be other people's, but in terms of like, what would a wine snob say? They would frown at boxed wine. That being said, I think boxes are actually one of the most environmentally friendly mechanisms for wine delivery, especially when it's coming from further away. So boxed wine really developed in Australia because in order to pack it in a cargo holder, you want to maximize the surface area. So bottles are like the least efficient way to ship anything anywhere. Think about all the empty space in that box. And so they developed this boxed wine concept where you can fill a bag with wine and put it in a box, and you can ship way more wine across the country, across the world. And I would say some wineries are now adapting that to be a much higher quality product, in a much more efficient delivery mechanism. You get a lot more wine generally for the same amount of money. And I think there are higher quality producers now. There's also now canned wine. There are wine bottles that are single serve. There are ones that are made with twist offs, with bottle caps, with tons of different closures. And the sort of experts were very hesitant to say high quality wine could come in anything other than a glass bottle with cork. And I think that we're starting to prove that wrong, that there's no impact to the flavor. And that it's a fun, sometimes more environmentally friendly way to package your goods.
And Jillian, we hadn't talked about this, but why don't you take the last minute or so and plug your website and any services that you provide?
Definitely. Thank you. So my website is sommepeoplesay.com. My name is Jillian Katz. My email address is right there. And I do at-home tastings, so I can help you, gather wines, and you can gather, your family or some friends on Zoom, and come together for a wine tasting with me. I'll guide you through it. In, good old days, I also do them in your home. So hopefully someday we'll be back to doing them in person as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jillian. Let's all raise a virtual glass here. Cheers.
Cheers.
Toast to Jillian for a wonderful presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this Thursday night. A lot of thanks are coming into the chat. Make sure to read the chat, Jillian, before you depart.
I will.
So everyone, you'll want to check your email tomorrow at some point. I'll be sending out an email. Click the link to fill out the survey. Let us know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events here at the library. So again, thank you all so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Thank you, guys.